On June 24th, in the year 1314, beneath a sky heavy with the weight of centuries, two armies faced each other across a narrow strip of Scottish ground, and in the space of 48 hours, the fate of an entire nation would be decided. Not by diplomacy, not by treaties signed in distant courts, but by steel, blood, and the desperate conviction that some fights are worth dying for. This was not a skirmish over borders or a dispute between nobles over land rights. This was the culmination of decades of humiliation, occupation, and resistance. On one side stood the massed power of England, the most formidable military machine in Western Europe, led by a king who could not afford to lose. On the other stood a ragged army of Scotsmen, outnumbered, out-equipped, fighting for something that had almost ceased to exist. A free Scotland. What happened in those 2 days would echo through the ages, not merely as a military victory, but as the birth of a nation that refused to die. The battle that unfolded near the marshy banks of a small stream called Bannockburn would determine whether Scotland survived as an independent kingdom or became a footnote in English history, swallowed whole by the ambitions of a southern empire that had spent 18 years trying to erase it from the map. The landscape itself seemed to understand the gravity of what was about to unfold. The ground near Stirling was unforgiving, low-lying, treacherous, cut through by streams that turned the earth into sucking mud when the rains came. The smell of damp soil mixed with the scent of pine from the distant forests, and in the early summer heat, the air hung thick and still, as if the land itself were holding its breath. This was not a place chosen by accident. Every stone, every rise in the ground, every patch of bog had been studied, measured, understood. The Scots had lived here, fought here, bled here for generations. They knew how the light fell through the trees at dawn, how the horses would struggle in the soft ground, how an army could be funneled into a killing field if the terrain was used correctly. And above it all loomed Stirling Castle, perched on its volcanic rock like a crown waiting to be claimed, its walls holding the last English garrison north of the border, the final symbol of occupation that had to fall. The castle was not just a fortress, it was a statement, a reminder that England believed Scotland belonged to them, that resistance was futile, that submission was inevitable. But on this day, inevitability would be tested. Robert Bruce stood among his men, not as a king who had inherited a throne through bloodline alone, but as something far more dangerous, a man who had clawed his way back from the edge of oblivion, who had been hunted like an animal, who had hidden in caves while his family was imprisoned and murdered, and who had emerged not broken, but forged into something harder than steel. He was not born into kingship the way most monarchs were. He had seized it, declared it, fought for every inch of recognition, and turned himself into the living embodiment of Scottish defiance. His enemies had called him a murderer, a traitor, an outlaw. His allies had abandoned him when it seemed he had no chance. But Bruce had understood something that his predecessors had not. He understood that Scotland would only survive if its people believed it, could, and that belief required a leader who would never, ever stop fighting. Over the past 8 years, he had waged a campaign of relentless guerrilla warfare, capturing castles, ambushing English patrols, striking and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. He had turned Scotland into a graveyard for English occupation forces, and now, finally, the English king himself was coming north with the full strength of his realm to crush him once and for all. History had bent around this man. Every choice he made rippled outward, reshaping the future. And now, on this narrow field near Stirling, he was about to make the most important choice of his life, to stand and fight, or to retreat and lose everything. But Bruce did not face a single enemy. He faced something far more terrifying, an empire. England in 1314 was not a kingdom in decline. It was a military superpower, wealthy, organized, and still drunk on the victories of Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, who had crushed every rebellion, burned every stronghold, and come within inches of erasing Scotland entirely. Edward I had been a warrior king, A tactician, a man who understood that power was not just taken, but maintained through relentless pressure. His son, Edward II, had inherited that legacy, and though he lacked his father's brilliance, he commanded the same vast resources. Thousands of heavily armored knights, waves of Welsh longbowmen whose arrows could darken the sky, and an endless supply of infantry drawn from every corner of the realm. This was not a feudal levy hastily assembled. This was the largest English army ever sent into Scotland, a force so overwhelming that its mere approach was meant to break the spirit of anyone who dared oppose it. The English did not need to win through tactics. They needed only to arrive, to show the Scots what futility looked like, to demonstrate that resistance was nothing more than a prelude to extinction. And they came with absolute confidence, because every calculation, every precedent, every lesson of history told them that Scotland could not win this fight. The coalition Bruce faced was not just military, it was psychological, economic, political. It was the weight of inevitability itself, the crushing certainty that some battles cannot be won, that some nations are too small to survive. And here was the promise that hung over everything. What happened in the next 48 hours would decide whether Scotland existed, not in theory, not as an idea whispered in exile, but as a real, functioning, independent kingdom. If Bruce lost, there would be no third chance, no miraculous comeback, no legend to inspire future generations. He would be executed, his followers scattered, his name erased. England would finish what it had started 18 years earlier, and Scotland would become a province, a memory, a cautionary tale about the futility of resisting conquest. But if Bruce won, if, against every rational expectation, his outnumbered, outgunned army managed to break the most powerful military force in Britain, then everything changed. Victory would not just save his crown, it would prove that Scotland could defend itself, that English occupation was not inevitable, that freedom was not a fantasy. The stakes were absolute. The clock was ticking, and every man who stood in those Scottish lines knew that they were not just fighting for land or titles or the favor of a king. They were fighting for the right to say, centuries later, that their nation had existed, had mattered, had refused to die. But to understand how that moment came to be, you have to go back, not to some mythic past, but to the cold, brutal reality of what Scotland had endured. In 1290, the kingdom had fallen into chaos when its young queen died without an heir. Rival claimants tore at each other, and the English king, Edward I, had seen an opportunity. He had offered to arbitrate, to bring peace, to help Scotland choose its next ruler. It was a lie. The moment Edward's forces crossed the border, they never left. He placed a puppet king on the throne, and when that king dared to assert independence, Edward deposed him and took direct control. Scotland was invaded, occupied, humiliated. Its nobles were forced to sign oaths of loyalty to the English crown. Its castles were garrisoned by English soldiers. Its people were governed by English officials. Resistance had flared up under William Wallace, a commoner who had become a legend, who had smashed an English army at Stirling Bridge and proven that Scotland could fight back. But Wallace had been betrayed, captured, dragged to London, and executed with a brutality designed to break the spirit of anyone who might follow him. For a time, it seemed like the English had won. Scotland's nobility was divided, its spirit crushed, its future erased. And then Robert Bruce, a man with his own claim to the throne, had made a choice that seemed insane at the time. He killed his rival inside a church, declared himself king, and dared the English to come for him. They did. Bruce was defeated, hunted, reduced to a fugitive hiding in the wilderness, while his wife and daughter were imprisoned in cages, while his brothers were executed, while everything he loved was systematically destroyed. But he did not stop. He rebuilt his forces one village at a time, one castle at a time, one battle at a time. He learned to fight not as a traditional knight, but as a guerrilla, striking where the enemy was weak, vanishing before they could retaliate, turning Scotland itself into a weapon against the occupiers. And when Edward I died in 1307, marching north to crush Bruce once more, his son inherited a war that was already slipping away. Edward II was not his father. He was weaker, less focused, distracted by court intrigue and personal rivalries. He let Scotland slip through his fingers, castle by castle, until only a handful of English strongholds remained, and the most important of those was Stirling. Bruce had laid siege to it, and the English garrison, trapped and starving, had agreed to a deal. If no English army relieved them by midsummer 1314, they would surrender. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare, because it forced Edward to act. If he did not march north, he would lose Stirling without a fight, and with it, any claim to control Scotland. But if he did march, Bruce could choose the ground, prepare the defences, and force a battle on his terms. Edward had no choice. He had to come. And so he gathered the largest army England had ever sent into Scotland, tens of thousands of men, and marched north, convinced that sheer numbers and superior equipment would crush the rebellion once and for all. Bruce, meanwhile, prepared his men not for survival, but for victory. He did not tell them they would hold the line. He told them they would break the English, that this was the moment everything changed, that history was watching, and his men believed him because they had followed him through hell and back, and because they knew that if they ran now, there would be nowhere left to run. By mid-June, the English army was closing in on Stirling. Reports came back to Bruce's camp every day, an army so large it took hours to pass a single point on the road, supply trains that stretched for miles, knights in armor so thick they seemed invincible. The sheer scale of it was meant to terrify, and it did. But Bruce did not retreat. Instead, he chose his ground carefully, near the Bannockburn, where the land narrowed into marshy bottlenecks, where cavalry would struggle, where his smaller force could hold a defensive line and force the English to come at them head-on. He positioned his schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen bristling with pikes, in overlapping lines, creating a wall of steel that could not be easily broken. He dug pits and scattered caltrops to cripple charging horses. He turned the terrain into a trap, and then he waited. The English scouts arrived first, probing the Scottish lines, testing their resolve. And on the afternoon of June 23rd, the first clash came, not the main battle, but a skirmish that would set the tone for everything that followed. English knights, confident in their superiority, charged at Bruce's position. Bruce himself, mounted on a small pony, met one of them in single combat, a massive English knight named Henry de Bohun, who charged with lance lowered, fully expecting to kill the Scottish king and end the war in a single blow. But Bruce, with reflexes honed by years of guerrilla warfare, sidestepped the charge and brought his axe down on de Bohun's helmet with such force that the blade split through steel and skull, killing him instantly. The symbolism was electric. The Scottish king, outnumbered and outgunned, had just killed an English champion in full view of both armies. Morale surged through the Scottish lines. Doubt crept into the English ranks, and Bruce knew in that moment that his men believed they could win. That night, the English army camped on low, wet ground, trapped between the Bannockburn and the Scottish positions. They had expected to sweep through, to crush the Scots with overwhelming force, but Bruce had chosen the battlefield perfectly. The English had numbers but no room to maneuver. Their cavalry, their greatest weapon, was hemmed in by marshland and narrow approaches. Their archers, deadly in open field battles, were blocked by their own knights. The English commanders argued among themselves, some urging caution, others demanding an immediate assault. Edward II, desperate to prove himself, overruled the voices of experience and ordered his forces forward at first light. The Scottish lines, meanwhile, stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness, every man knowing that when the sun rose, they would either be free or they would be dead. There was no in-between, no negotiation, no surrender. Bruce moved among his soldiers, not giving grand speeches, but simply being seen, reminding them that they had come too far to turn back now. The men whispered prayers, checked their weapons, and waited. And when the first light of June 24th crept over the horizon, the English army began to move. The battle did not begin with a single charge. It began as chaos, waves of English knights trapped in narrow ground, trying to force their way through the Scottish schiltrons, only to be impaled on a forest of pikes. Horses screamed and thrashed as they were pulled down. riders thrown into the mud, trampled by their own lines pushing from behind. The English had numbers, but numbers meant nothing when there was no room to deploy them. The Scottish formations held an immovable wall of iron discipline, and every time the English charged, they were driven back. Hours passed. The battle became a grinding, brutal test of endurance. Men collapsed from exhaustion, replaced by fresh fighters. The ground turned to mud mixed with blood. Armor, meant to protect, became a death trap as knights fell and could not rise under the weight of their own equipment. The English archers, finally brought forward, began to rain arrows on the Scottish lines, but Bruce had anticipated this. He sent light cavalry to scatter the archers, breaking their formations before they could do decisive damage. And still, the Scottish line held. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It simply absorbed everything the English threw at it and refused to break. Then came the moment that changed everything. Bruce saw it before anyone else. The English were not losing. They were stuck. Their formations were tangled, their command structure fractured, their king somewhere in the rear, unable to control the chaos. The Scots were winning by not losing, but that was not enough. If this turned into a war of attrition, the English would eventually overwhelm them through sheer weight of numbers. Bruce made the call. He ordered the schiltrons forward, not to retreat, not to hold, to attack. The Scottish formations, which had been defensive walls, transformed into moving, battering rams of steel. They advanced slowly, methodically, pushing the English back step by step, and as they advanced, the English line began to crack. Panic spread. Units broke. Knights turned and fled, colliding with their own reserves, creating a chain reaction of collapse. The disciplined English army, the greatest military force in Britain, disintegrated into a panicked mob, and suddenly it was not a battle anymore, it was a rout. The English fled in every direction, but there was nowhere to go. Behind them was the Bannockburn, now swollen and treacherous, hundreds drowned trying to cross, weighed down by armor that had been meant to make them invincible. Others were cut down as they ran, hunted through the marshland by Scottish soldiers who had been hunted themselves for 18 years and now tasted revenge. Edward II, the King of England, barely escaped with his life, fleeing the battlefield with a small escort while his army was destroyed around him. It was not a glorious retreat. It was a humiliation, a total collapse, and the few English soldiers who made it back across the border carried with them the story of a disaster so complete that it shattered the myth of English invincibility. The Scottish pursuit continued for miles, bodies littering the roads, banners abandoned, armor stripped from the dead. And when the killing finally stopped, when the last English soldier had either fled or died, the Scots stood on the field. They had defended and realized what they had done. They had not just won a battle, they had broken an empire's will. The aftermath was silence. The field near Bannockburn was a graveyard, littered with thousands of dead, English nobles among them, men who had ridden north confident in their superiority and died choking on Scottish mud. Stirling Castle surrendered without another arrow fired. The English garrison, watching from the walls, had seen their relief force destroyed and knew there was no point in holding out. Bruce had won his gamble, but victory carried a cost. Scottish casualties were far lighter than the English, but every man lost was a man they could not afford to lose. The nation had bled itself to survive, and the scars would remain for generations. Bruce did not celebrate. He knew the English would be back, that this victory bought time, but not permanent peace. But for now, Scotland existed, and that was enough. What happened at Bannockburn in 1314 was not just a battle. It was a declaration, written in blood, that Scotland would not be erased. Every attempt to subjugate it had failed. Every army sent north had been broken, and the man who had refused to surrender, who had turned himself into a symbol of resistance, was now a king in fact as well as name. England would continue to claim sovereignty over Scotland for years, but after Bannockburn those claims rang hollow. The Scots had proven they could defend themselves, and in 1328, England formally recognized Scottish independence in the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. Robert Bruce, once a hunted fugitive, died a king, and the nation he saved outlasted every empire that tried to conquer it. The legacy of Bannockburn did not fade with time. It became the foundation of Scottish identity, a story passed down through centuries, a reminder that some fights, no matter how impossible they seem, are worth fighting. And on that narrow field near Stirling, in the summer of 1314, Scotland did not just survive, it was born.